Welcome to another episode of the. Oh no, what are we on? Lockdown discussions. I was about to say something else. Number 10, numero 10. This is Kit Kalis and Gary Budden at your service from Influx Press, and we're here to do the lockdown discussion of the week. And today, Gary, what is it?
So we came up with this concept yesterday, based off of a tweet. We've kind of got into the habit of kind of trying to crowdsource what we should talk about because we're running out of our own ideas, basically.
When you say getting into the habit of doing it, we're lazy. No, so,
we're lazy, yeah. No, but we've covered quite a few wide-ranging topics, so it's always trying to come up with an interesting spin on things. Anyway, we had a tweet from Juliet Jakes. Why do publishers still shy away from short fiction when it feels like the perfect form for the age? So we'll cover some of that, but we wanted to kind of expand it out a bit. So we're talking about, what are publishers afraid of?
Yes, what are we afraid of? What? Not well, we as in personally, but also publishers as a kind of other out there somewhere of what they do and they don't do, and also I think perhaps publishing as an industry as well, maybe. So not just about the literal work, but maybe types of people, demographics, PR, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, and because we'd started talking about that idea about the short stories, but we kind of wanted to expand it out a bit beyond the scope of just the short stories. But before we start...
so I was going to say, there was one request for us to talk about sex and writing from Leonie Ross.
I saw that, yeah.
I noticed that you ignored it.
Well, I was only catching up on the tweets this morning, and I don't know what I would say about that at the moment. It's not...
I don't think I've ever edited a proper sex scene, so I don't have much, or written one. I'm too middle class in English to be doing that sort of stuff.
The thing is, isn't it? It's if you get it wrong, I mean, it's really bad, and it'll kind of haunt you. And I think,
but if you get it right, can be quite good if you get it right.
Yeah.
I don't know. I would rather talk to someone like Leonie than talk to you about it. I'll be perfectly honest. I've known you since I was 11, which is fine, but I think I just don't think we're necessarily experts in sex literature.
I would agree with that.
So maybe I'll do a literature under the influence with Leonie or something like that, and we can talk about it there.
Yeah, I mean, I could talk about books I've enjoyed that I think write about sex very well, but different discussion for a different day, I think.
It is something you might be afraid of.
But before we start,
yeah,
we're going to talk about, what have you been reading this week? Been reading anything good? Watching anything good?
I've been tweeting about this a little bit as well. So this is Joe Kennedy's Authenticrats. The subline is Culture, Politics, and the New Seriousness. It's essentially about more or less the political centre. So we're not talking about Tories, we're not like on the right wing, we're not really talking about the Labour left, we're talking about that kind of mystical centre of the sort of Robert Webbs and your Nick Cohens and that sort of stuff.
Centrists, essentially.
Yeah, I'd say, your J.K. Rowlings of the world. And about how they seem to be obsessed with some sort of sense of authenticity, and are always looking for an authentic working class to talk about, or they're always looking for authentic means of expression, but they are quite dictatorial in what is authentic and what isn't, hence authenticrat and authenticratic. And there's that's the kind of basis of it, but there's some really interesting chapters I think you'd really like as well. There's a whole chapter called The Dialectics of Banter.
Was that written directly for you?
I feel like it was a chapter written absolutely for me. But it's all about the 90s and politics in the 90s and the move from sort of the kind of free party stuff into Britpop, into British culture becoming cool, but all set against this idea of kind of the John Major stuffy moralism into this sort of freewheeling Blairism of like anything goes until 2001, and then like we get the moral crusading Blair, which changes everything. They had like a sweet 4 years of like, it's kind of like.
Well, we've talked about that before, haven't we? That there's in the UK, I suppose we felt that if ever there was a period where things were maybe, possibly, maybe all right, maybe, was basically between 1998 with the Good Friday Agreement and 2001, which is basically what, 3 years. 3 years of there not being just disaster all the time.
He writes about that period really interestingly, and as a time of when people believed in the future.
Yeah.
And now I think people don't believe in the future, and that's why the book is a really interesting read, I think. Yeah.
Well, not to be too depressing, but I think I do think we've given up on an idea of the future. Definitely.
The future's been cancelled.
Yeah, the future has been cancelled. I'm going to talk about something I watched, first of all. It's funny you talk about this idea of authenticity and working classness, because last night I watched the film you'd recommended to me, the film Bait by Mark Jenkin.
Which
great film.
Sorry, yes. We're talking about film, aren't we? It's not a book. It's not adapted from a book. What am I talking about? Yes, great film.
Really, very, very, very pertinent film set in a unnamed Cornish fishing village, and the main protagonist is a guy called Martin, I think, and he's a sort of slightly dispossessed Cornish fisherman. He's lost his boat. His brother has stopped fishing. Instead, he's doing like boat trips for complete arsehole drunk tourists, and it's about the sort of tension between him and the second homers, who are the people who they buy property in places like Cornwall, but they only perhaps live there for 2 months a year, which is a real blight on areas like that, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
What I liked about it is that they're not presented entirely unsympathetically, and he's quite a grumpy, inflexible man. You feel he probably would have voted Brexit because of the fishing stuff, and it's really clever, nuanced film about a really hot topic in Britain, about class, about who owns space and all this stuff. In terms of authenticity, it's kind of filmed on 16mm film, isn't it? It's kind of got this very grainy, old-fashioned film sense to it, which I presume is to go for a sense of, I don't know.
Apparently, he developed it in buckets in his house. He developed the film in buckets, so it's got even that sense. It almost feels salty.
It does, yeah. And I think it works. I mean, because you could just see that as a sort of just an aesthetic choice with no reason behind it, but it works. It feels like a really modern story, but with this kind of quite old-fashioned aesthetic. I don't know. I loved it. Would highly recommend.
The editing can be quite jarring at points. It's not edited in a slick, professional. What you might. I mean, it's obviously that he's made these decisions deliberately. It's not like he's a cat-handed at editing, but it goes against sort of type. In that sense of like the match cuts don't necessarily work. There's like close-ups which jar with the action, and I think it's really interesting.
Yeah, there's like brief close-ups are almost like something out of a Sergio Leone movie, like on the eyes, like those old westerns. Yeah. Anyway, loved it. And very quickly, I just finished a book last night, so I'm about to start this, which is Bestiary and Selected Stories by Julio Cortázar. A writer who I've read bits and bobs of before, but this new edition came out recently from Vintage, and I was going to jump into it. Influx author and our friend Fernando Strigotti rates Cortázar very, very highly.
I think he does. That's something he definitely rates. Yeah, he's a Cortázar fan.
And I just wanted to read more of Cortázar. I'd read one of his stories in translation, a new translation, a few years ago called Headache, which I thought was fantastic, and I always wanted to read more. So, yeah. But I haven't actually started it yet, so I can't tell you what it's like.
Well, we could all talk about stuff we haven't read yet, Gary. But then it would be like one of those video blogs where we're like, I've got sent all these books, I haven't read any of them.
I never understood that. That's a big thing, isn't it? Oh yeah, one last thing. It's got 2 introductions in it. It's got a new one from Kevin Barry and one from 1997 by Alberto Manguel. So
2 introductions. I've never seen that before.
Well, I suppose Manguel must have written his introduction. He wrote it in 97, and then Kevin Barry's written a new one.
So when it gets published in 2040, someone will write a new one.
Yeah, but I quite like the idea of stacking up the introductions. I like
that as well.
Okay, but let's get on to the main meat of what we're talking about. What are publishers afraid of? So, I mean, how should we start on this? So, let's talk about the short story issue first of all. Let me just bring the tweet up again. I mean, how do you feel about that? Do you think it's something that publishers do shy away from, publishing short fiction? And I presume, Juliet, means they're bigger publishers than the independents, because we publish a lot of short fiction.
I think she's implying that. I think the independent publishing has always published a lot of short fiction. Mm-hmm. I think there was a time, maybe before 4 years ago, where the traditional thing to say would be short stories don't make money. Mm-hmm. And I've parroted that a number of times, taking it as a kind of received wisdom from the industry, right? Of like, oh yeah, short stories don't sell. Don't expect your short story book to make any money, blah, blah, blah.
And of course, that's how nothing ever changes, right? If everyone
So I was like, well, that's clearly right. That's what everyone says. And then obviously that completely changed, particularly for us with Atrib. But I think that's not, I wouldn't be so narcissistic to suggest that we changed the way things are. I think we jumped onto a train that was already moving.
Yeah.
And I think there's been a lot of successful short story collections since, which are being treated in the same space as novels. But I do think there's an issue with not necessarily readers, but with the way short stories are marketed as sort of slightly, not lesser, but you have that whole David Saloy thing of, oh, if we want it to win some prizes, it's got to be a novel. So there's a culture around publishing short stories where it's not allowed to compete with novels, right? So the Bailey's Prize for fiction, or the Booker Prize for fiction, is only for novels. You can't actually win it for short story, but short stories are fiction. Yeah. So, change the name of the prize to the Booker Prize for novels, or include short fiction.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? And it's why do these attitudes persist? And I think part of it is precisely what you've just said, which is received wisdom. I think, to be 100% honest, I think there's a lot of lazy journalism about this stuff that falls back into these kind of cliches and quotes about short fiction, viewing them as lesser. And I don't think it's done intentionally, but I think because of this received wisdom, and I do think within the Anglo world, this is very strongly a kind of British issue, as opposed to, let's say, American English or Irish, of viewing short fiction still as somehow lesser, especially from writers who are themselves British. I think we're far happier celebrating a collection of American short fiction or of Irish short fiction than we are of something that was from London or from England or wherever. And
in translation. So books in translation are also short story collections. Like I've got one here actually. This one, Mariana Enriquez, very celebrated,
amazing book.
Published by Portobello, Granter. Financial Times for the claustrophobic terror. Vanity Fair, phenomenal. Dave Eggers, mesmerizing. Like New York Times, a lot of this stuff is Guardian's best summer reads. This is like a really accepted form in Latin American short story collection, and yet somehow the British one is. Maybe it's not fetishized. Maybe they fetishize that stuff. I don't know.
I think there's something in that. And if I think about successful writers from the USA who are currently celebrated, there's Carmen Maria Machado, her first book, Her Body and Other Stories, amazing. Earlier on than that, Junot Díaz, very much celebrated for his short fiction, and rightly so, I think, for all these writers. And then I struggle to find the equivalent of British writers being celebrated to that amount. But I do think some of that is changing, actually. So Influx, for anyone who doesn't know, during lockdown, we've been doing a series of events on Instagram Live, haven't we, in collaboration with Picador. with the hashtag. What's the hashtag again? Strange stories for strange times. Or short stories for
short
strange
stories. Yeah, the keys in the short stories bit. Yeah.
And actually, obviously, Picador are a much bigger publisher than us, but they are publishing lots of interesting new debut short story writers. I've got one of them here. I haven't read this yet, but I'm going to. Salt Slow by Julia Armfield, who did an event with Annabelle Banks fairly recently. A great chat they had about short fiction. So I feel that maybe the situation is changing because there's been a few big successes of British short story collections.
Yeah, I think so. Chris Power's Mother is probably another example. I think Faber published that. I think so. Wendy Erskine, Sweet Home, although that was obviously originally published by Stinging Fly in Ireland, so not technically a direct. Well, not in that British. I mean, if she's Northern Irish, well, let's not get into that.
Don't get into that.
Not from mainland England.
Sorry, it really made me laugh. I did. I was like, abort.
Anyway, so but I do think there's hopefully it's changing, but who knows? I mean, these things are trendy. They're swings and roundabouts, aren't they? Really, but I think that there has been a fear that short story collections will not make as much money as a novel will, and there's a fear of them, I think, being seen as perhaps a bit thin, and that there's in publishing and possibly I don't think this is the readers doing.
These things seen by who? I mean,
exactly.
I don't think anecdotal evidence is often that helpful. But just me personally, I don't think I've ever met any reader ever who I know who likes reading books who've gone, "Oh, I don't like short stories." But
that's like someone saying, "I don't like music."
Yeah,
you meet those people, and you're like, "Who are you?"
I've met one or two of them. That really baffled me.
When you look in the mirror, they disappear. Yeah. I think I don't think people. I think people just like reading. Like, it doesn't matter what format it really comes in. But I think there's definitely a cultural baggage on the weighty tome. On the big novel. Maybe that comes from those really early ones like Moll Flanders, and then in that sort of that period of George Eliot, like Middlemarch, and there's always been the big weighty. So the Victorian novels are often quite fat, and perhaps we haven't quite got out of that because we haven't really got out of the Victorian era anyway.
No, not really. I mean, it's interesting, that, isn't it? People might think of the big Dickensian novel, but everyone knows the fact that lots of those kind of novels are written
serialized,
period serialized, which is why they're so long. But they have the sort of I do still think that there's an idea that like a fatter spine means that you feel like you're getting more value for money if you're spending a tenner on a book. Bang for your buck, which to me seems an odd way to look at something. It should be about the quality of the work, not the word count.
Yeah, I agree. There's see if I can find it. There's a book. Yeah, here it is. Hold on. Not a short story collection, but I just wanted to. So this is Edouard Louis. I really like him. So this is his most recent book, and we've got how many pages? 79 pages of text.
Yeah.
And the text is set like this. Loads of white space. Big text. So we're looking at no more than probably 150 words per page. I love him, so I bought it. $10.99.
That does seem a bit much for an 80-page book.
$10.99 for an 80-page book, and I think I've got robbed.
I've got actually interesting comparison. So this Cortázar book published by Vintage, I opened it up and I was like, oh, so the type's very small.
Yeah, that's dense.
But maybe they made that decision that maybe people don't want to buy a book of short stories that's that sort of fat.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? The Ballard ones are really thick. The collected volumes, like there's 2 volumes, and they're like monsters. But they know who they're publishing for there, I think.
Yeah, exactly, and that's more sort of kind of almost like having them all in an archive, because they would have been original collections that have then all been put together into these different volumes. So it's a slightly different thing.
So I'm not sure it's necessarily fear-based in the sense of being afraid of reaction or bad publicity. I think it's more being afraid of the book not being a commercial success. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And this is something we've tackled a number of times, isn't it? That the tension between putting out good work for the sake of good work and the kind of financial, economic factors is a real one. And obviously, at least for Influx Press, we can't really have like lost leaders in the same way, can we? The book that will get loads and loads of critical acclaim but not sell very much because it helps, maybe helps our brand or whatever. Our books do need to sell copies, otherwise if none of our books sell enough copies, we simply can't carry on, can we?
No, because we don't have an archive, a backlist that stretches back to kind of 1920s like a lot of publishers do. But I do think when we do make critically acclaimed books, they sell, conversely. So, I don't know, we can't afford what you might term a loss leader, but I don't think we'd be able to produce one, because a loss leader would need a heavy investment. First, like a loss leader is something you invest in. You probably pay quite a decent amount of money for to have a prestige author that might win a prize or whatever. And then they sell 5,000 copies as opposed to your other imprint that's got Jack Reacher books in it or whatever, which are just pumping millions back into the business. So I think every time we consider how much we can pay for a book, what the advance is, etc., we're assuming it's going to sell enough copies to match the advance and go beyond.
Okay. Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think so. Really, the imperative is the only thing we'd be afraid of, or why people might shy away from the short story collection, is, we think, mainly an economic one, based on received wisdom. Bless you.
Sorry. Yeah.
Very hay fevery at the moment, isn't it?
I sneezed on a podcast straight video. That's really pleasant for everyone. I think so. I think you're right. Yeah. I'm not afraid of the format itself. In fact, sometimes what I'm afraid of is not being adventurous enough. And thinking, is this just a bit too mainstream? Because what am I doing it for? If I wanted to publish something really mainstream, I could go and work for a mainstream publisher. So, there's that delicate balance between going, we want it to sell, but also I'm not in this to be like, have a Sunday Times bestseller. I'm in it to produce really interesting work and challenging work. I think our tagline is something about producing challenging fiction. But it's I would be sometimes I can be worried of being like, is this different enough? Like, how does this fit in with my way of seeing publishing?
Different enough from what? From what we've published previously, or different enough from everything else in the publishing landscape? I think
I'd be afraid of following trends. And I don't know whether that's because I'm afraid of it myself, or I'm afraid of the other people looking at me following the trend. So is it someone else's gaze on me being like, oh, he's just a trend follower now? Or is it really me going, I don't want to follow trends? There's what you think of yourself, and there's what you think other people think of yourself.
Yeah.
And they're slightly different things.
Okay, so I've got some more thoughts on that, but we'll come back to that in a second. Just to clarify a few things. So we're talking about what are publishers afraid of. Are we talking about all publishers here? Or are we talking about what we're afraid of? I think it might be good to try and separate these things out. So you mentioned the publishing industry as a whole, and let's say the mainstream publishing industry. Let's talk about that separately to what we do in the independent sphere. I think it's probably good to kind of pull those two apart, because I think they're slightly different. So let's do the first one. I think there's two questions to this. Like, what do people think mainstream publishing is afraid of? What do you think it's actually afraid of?
I think people think mainstream publishing is afraid of new things and afraid of change. And it's been afraid of change for a very long time, perhaps. But I think it's more potentially afraid of disruption from the sorts of people they don't want to be in mainstream publishing. So as we discussed in previous podcasts, we both think mainstream publishing is riddled with class issues.
It is.
It's also riddled with race issues in terms of how many people of colour work in publishing, as in there's not very many rather than anything else. And I think people are afraid of new people coming along and taking their relevance away from them. Because when you work in publishing, I think you consider yourself probably to be relevant to culture and cultural production. Someone else can come along and say, your ideas are old, you're old, get out. And that's a real fear, I think, for a lot of people, is that they're suddenly not relevant when they're a cultural producer. To be a cultural producer and not be relevant, it is probably pointless in some ways. And I mean relevant in the sense of responding to your times rather than being in the newspapers or being, do you know what I mean? Like there's a different, I'm not talking about it being relevance in the sense of like someone says, oh, that's irrelevant. Like we're not talking about that anymore. It's more about being relevant in the sense of you're moving along with things. You're not stuck doing the same thing over and over again.
And that does also relate to the kind of commercial economic side of things, doesn't it? Whenever you read one of those sort of biannual "the novel is dead" pieces in the papers, there's always some worry, isn't there, about how the literary novel, is only. I suppose once again the argument was becoming a kind of upper middle class elite plaything for those with the time and the luxury, and it's got its own coded language and would only appeal to presumably a dwindling pool of readers. Now, if you're a publisher and you make your money, selling books, surely you don't want that to be the case. So you're going to have to move with the times and make the stuff that is being published basically reflect the kind of changing demographics of the UK and maybe try and redress some historic imbalances to that.
Yeah, I think so. That would be the correct commercial decision. But I'm not sure everybody follows that because
I resist this idea. No, I resist the idea that there's this sort of evil cabal of they controlling things. I just think big companies get quite ossified and don't work always properly, or they don't communicate with the different departments. And it's very easy for a tiny operation like us to change quickly. It's much harder for any big organisation to be able to change speedily, I think.
Yeah, I agree with that. But I do think there's a reticence in publishing to change in the same, in the way that they're like, all the time we just be like, well, this is how we've always done it.
Yeah, because change is a ball ache, isn't it?
Yeah.
It is. It's effort. People don't like the effort.
It's also going into an unknown space. It's much easier to, what are people afraid of? They're always afraid of the unknown. So it's about being able to embrace that unknownness and walk into it thinking, right, we don't know what's going to happen, but let's just give it a go. A lot of people are probably afraid for that. And I think, like we said previously as well, like, your books have got to sell, otherwise your job's on the line. And that reinforces itself. If you take a couple of risks and they don't pay off, what do you do then?
Well, yeah, I mean, I've mentioned that in previous episodes, haven't I, about, I don't know if this applies to every company, but certain pressures that acquiring editors will be under.
Yeah.
That go against risk-taking.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard for us, I think, to speak about big publishing like this because we don't really work in it. And a lot of it's going to come from conversations we have with people who do.
Yeah, exactly. And
But from the outside, sometimes it looks like when you're at Frankfurt or LBF and you go to some sort of soiree in the evening and everyone's chatting away and they're all talking about like a particular book that got signed a couple of weeks ago and someone's going, I just got outbid, or that was my book, I wanted it. Sometimes I wonder whether they just want it because someone else wants it. And they're afraid
yeah, in a strange way, I think people do use that language, but I think we covered this in our episode. Why that when people say, "Oh, that was my book," I don't. Ultimately, you're still an employee of the company, which is slightly different. I feel more invested in the books we do now than I ever did with almost any book I worked on at previous jobs.
Yeah.
And I think that's just natural. I absolutely love some of the books I worked on and commissioned at Titan That, but I think I would have loved it even more if I'd been the one publishing it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's one side of it. I think people are also afraid of getting it wrong, in the sense of criticism, like, you know.
Yeah, so I think now, we can move on to talking about, I suppose, us really and independent publishers, what we're afraid of. So, what is getting it wrong then? What do you mean?
Well, what's getting it wrong?
Getting what wrong?
Okay, I think we both maybe feel this a bit. So editorially, when I'm editing, sometimes I'm worried that I would have missed something that might a reader might look at that changes the entire nature of the book, or that gets criticism in a review. You know, it's for us a lot of the time our job as editors is to almost protect the book from. You can't stop it from being criticized, but it's kind of like protecting it from being criticized and working out, okay, well, that could be something someone's going to criticize. How do we, when you do an essay, a lot of the time you kind of front load your argument with kind of caveats to prevent someone then saying, oh, well, you didn't think of this, oh, well, you didn't think of that. And you go, I thought of this, and I'm still thinking this, and I feel like sometimes as editors, we look at books and we're like, yeah, actually, the way this chapter ends or the way that character works, it's just, I like it, but I'm not sure whether all the readers are going to like it, or I don't know if everyone's going to agree with how that operates. You know what I mean?
I do know what you mean, because this is it's a very, I think, very pertinent issue to us, because especially if you're publishing, let's say, slightly more risk taking or boundary pushing novels, let's say slightly more transgressive fiction or fiction about potentially explosive subjects, you have to be more careful with this. So that's something always in the back of my mind, thinking, especially if we're doing something that's, let's say, a more provocative piece of work, is getting that balance right, because we're not just thinking, because again, this comes back to the tension between, art and commerce. We're not just thinking of how good is this book. We're also thinking of the audience, aren't we? How it's going to be received, how it's going to be reviewed, how people are going to talk about it on social media and all those things. So anything that might potentially cause issues there, that's what we should be looking for as editors, right?
Right, exactly.
And certain books I might do an edit, and then I would, I have done this. I had essentially a copy editor or something, but also act as a kind of sensitivity reader to certain things, because I'm a white 37-year-old man. There are certain things that don't bother me. How tanned I am. What was I saying? Yeah, and I'm just aware that there's certain things necessarily that I will miss.
Oh, absolutely. This has happened to me before. So with Hold Tight, Jeffrey Blatch's book, we had a proof. It was great. Everyone loved it. A couple of people, writers, I sent it to, women, black women. So it wasn't necessarily like a race thing. One of them picked out a chapter and just said, I think this is a bit off in terms of the way it's writing about women. And I went back to Jeffrey, and he was like, oh my God, yeah, it is. And we both, because of our obvious maleness, had missed the fact that there was, maybe it wasn't treating that particular, so as a particular music track, it wasn't treating that particular track in the same way it treated a different one by a man. And this is a book about black masculinity, so the irony being that it was kind of almost reinforced inside the book itself. But I was really grateful that was pulled up, and so was Jeffrey. Like, he was totally unconscious, or like he didn't mean to be writing like that, so it wasn't this kind of deliberate way. And so we looked at the feedback and we were like, all right, like change it. Like that's totally fine. It's something we both missed. We're both men. That once you get that feedback, so you do sometimes need those sensitivity readers, and that's also partly what sending books out or PDFs ahead of time is to get feedback from other people, and like what if that had gone out, and the woman who gave the feedback loved the book. It's not like she loved it and she supported it when it came out, and because we'd also listened to her, but because we both missed it, and I think that would have been picked up and criticised, and we would have gone, oh, why didn't we see that?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, well,
it's not something that was intentional in a way.
Yeah, and going back to like fears, I suppose. So my fear is, let's say something like that I might have thought was okay. The writer thinks okay, but someone possibly finds unacceptable, should we say? What I would hate to happen is there to be the equivalent of a social media kind of shitstorm or a pile-on or something like that happens, because I don't think I would ever do this myself. I think there's a terrible culture on Twitter of public shaming about stuff. If I read a book and there's something in it I find a little bit objectionable, I don't think I'd take a picture of it and put it out there publicly. I might send it to my friends and go, oh, this is a bit, do you know what I mean? Or if I wrote a review of it, it might be in a considered appreciation of the whole book. Because what can happen is something that's actually quite minor in a story can then overshadow the entire book. That hasn't actually ever happened to us, but I'm worried about that happening.
I think a lot of writers are as well. There's an element of sort of, I suppose, cancel culture is a shorthand for it, even though I don't think that's possibly what we're quite talking about. I think that at any given stage you can take something out of context, and I think what we were talking about before with the sort of transgressive fiction is you're writing about characters, you're writing characters who are essentially horrible people, and it's interesting with, say, someone like Bret Easton Ellis, who, with American Psycho or Glamorama. He's writing about his characters are all horrible people, but then it also turns out that Bret Easton Ellis is a horrible person. So where do you go from there? It's really it's the intention of the author, but also, like, I guess what I'm trying to say is that I think there's a difference between something being thought-provoking and something being provocative.
Yeah.
And when something's needlessly provocative, that's when you can be like, look, man, come on. Did you have to do that? What was the point of doing that? But when something's thought-provoking and has an argument or thinking around it, and it's been considered properly, I think that's when you take that out of context, that's what I'd be afraid of.
Yeah. And I suppose the flip side of that is maybe it would be a good thing. A good shitstorm can sell a few copies of a book, can't it?
Yeah, I mean, like, let's go back to Easton Ellis again. Like, he did that horrible, terrible, I mean, I read half of it, essay collection called White, which is essentially like talking about whiteness and all that sort of stuff, but from a kind of really privileged, sort of nasally, British Ellis-y way. That sold because that's what he wanted it to do. He wanted to provoke people into buying the book. I think American Psycho was quite a good read, but I don't think I particularly enjoyed reading it.
No, I remember really liking Less Than Zero when I read it at the time.
Yeah, but I think that's the issue with this sort of transgressive stuff, or even hyper-violent books, or when you're using violence to say something about the world or say something about a character. Actually, that can be difficult to rein. Because sometimes you don't know where the line is. You don't know who's going to be upset by something and who's not. And
absolutely,
it's a difficult tightrope.
You mentioned earlier you worry about almost playing it too safe. So this is a worry I have of, we're putting together our Influx list for 2021 at the moment, which won't be announced till September. Something I think we're both very proud of. There's some books on there that are dealing with some quite explosive topics and very contemporary topics, done really, really well, I think, expertly written about. My fear would be that I would shy away from publishing a book about an uncomfortable subject because of this fear I've just mentioned, of thinking this book is, let's say, examining a really like toxic aspect of masculinity, or it's dealing with a really difficult, problematic part about like racism in the UK. And I worry about thinking, well, we won't do that because it might upset some people. Do you see what I mean? I don't think that will happen, but I suppose I'm worried about letting my sort of commercial brain overtake the kind of the artistic one. Do you know what I mean?
Sure, and also like it's not just that as well. You do have to think about the author, and you know, if they get labeled as a sort of sub-rated Michael Houellebecq, or like, you know, it's not going to do well for their career, perhaps. I don't know, unless they want to be like that. But yeah,
I don't think it happens, and I think that's why we spend quite a lot of time now thinking about how essentially we position a book, don't we?
Again, no, I think it's to do with the intention of the book. If the intention is to show something, to be able to look at it from all angles, 3 dimensions, whatever, to investigate a character, to tackle difficult subject matter. If the intention is to do that, not just to needlessly titillate, or to just downright offend for no other reason than to offend, then, you know, you got to wonder why you're doing it. But if you're using character and that character happens to be offensive, but you're using them to investigate something, that's different. It's all about intention. And
yeah, I agree.
I think often readers get that more or less most of the time. Sometimes I think reviewers and people who are writing about books willfully misunderstand it in order to generate some sort of clickbaity review.
Yeah, and I think that actually that's really well put, and I think that's something I don't worry about it a lot, but it does. There's a slight anxiety about that, but not enough to make me start publishing safer things, I don't think.
No, but it is interesting, isn't it?
It would piss me off. I know it would piss me off, but you know, it's all part of it, really, isn't it?
But yeah, but it's like a twin. It's a twin anxiety. One is that you're not sure you're going to catch the thing that is actually bad, and the other thing is you're going to act too safe because you're trying to catch the thing. It's like this weird kind of loop that you just go around in.
Yeah, it's a bit of a tightrope act. It relates to something you alluded to before. I mean, another fear I have with Influx, and probably in my own writing in general, and all that is complacency. Really, I don't want to be. I mean, I think it's nice where the press is at this point, but I always think we need to be trying to think ahead of things, always trying to do stuff a little bit different, and not, as they say, rest on your laurels. I don't really know what a laurel is, where that phrase comes from. Is it like, what is that phrase? But anyway.
Yeah, I don't know what a laurel is.
You rest on it, I guess.
What is it though? Is it like an arm? Is that what you're saying? It's an armchair?
I don't know. I'm going to find out after this.
But
I don't want to be complacent, and
no, I don't think we can afford to be complacent. I think
exactly. I don't think we can afford to be complacent, because there will always be someone or a group of people who are younger than us, who are coming up and thinking, right, we want to do something fresh, new and exciting. They might, you know, in the independent press world, they might look at publishers like us and, you know, the kind of group we're a part of and think, right, we want to, you know, eclipse them.
Those old bastards.
Which I actually kind of hope that there is some people out there.
Mate, if it's not happening,
they want to blow us out of the water. That would make me very happy.
But if that wasn't happening, I'd be worried for the cultural future of the UK. You know, but it's not like we've been going for nearly 10 years, and 10 years ago we were looking at people being like, "Oh, we'd be better than them. We'd do better than me. We'd do better than them." If there's not someone 10 years younger than us doing that now, then something's gone wrong, right? And actually, that is another thing in terms of the fear of being irrelevant. Or becoming, like, say, ossified or resting on your laurels. Something a friend of ours, Sean, talks about at Ninja Tune, his record label, that they constantly employ younger people in terms of the talent scouting, in terms of like finding new music, because younger people are more relevant to that genre, well, not genre, to music in general, if you're going to be a forward-moving, progressive music label, you're going to want young people involved because they're the ones in the clubs. You don't want to be the old guy, 45 years old, in the club, just like, this is a banger. You know,
Yeah.
you want you, and I think publishing can learn a lot from that. Like, I think Sanya for us is brilliant. She's young, she picks out books we might not necessarily pick out. She has ideas we might not necessarily have, and I think conversely, there's what I was talking about before in terms of people being afraid of things being disruptive or being afraid of change. Like the opposite fear of that is being afraid of things not changing. You know, there's again two sides of the same coin, and I feel like if we didn't have Sanya, we would have to invent her. Because
get a few more young people
involved. Because like,
but it's also learning to, I think, to listen to other people's opinions as well, especially people who are maybe, you know, from a slightly younger generation or different backgrounds to you. And I think that's something everyone has to learn. I like to think we do that quite well, but it's always making sure you're still listening to what people are saying. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I'm not sure we listen to each other very well, but I don't think it really matters.
No, I don't think that does matter. But I mean, it's always like you have your own taste in books and literature, and I have my own taste. That's not always the stuff we would publish, but it's just always remembering, and this is advice for life, anyone watching this, it's always remember that that's not the only experience in the world.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Is there anything else you're afraid of? I think we can probably wrap it up in a minute. It's pretty decent so far. What are you afraid of as a writer? Because you're also a writer as well as publisher. What would you be afraid of in terms of writing?
It was all a waste of time. Not finding.
Well, you get to your deathbed, you're like, what was the point of that?
Well, you know, people do feel that periodically about their own work, don't they? My fear is that it would be misunderstood. I think everyone has that. My own personal fiction work, I hope people have said to me it's very you, Gary, but I hope there's a kind of ambiguity in the work, but I wouldn't want that always to be misunderstood. The new book that's out in October, we'll have to see what people think of it. There's a couple of stories in there I think are not controversial, but they go into some sort of dark areas, I think, about masculinity and sexuality and things like that. So I'd be worried that was misunderstood. Okay.
I think I'd be more afraid if someone said to me, it's very Gary, about my writing. And vice versa, I'm sure. But
that is a fear of mine, though, just doing something generic. I don't think I ever would do it, but I think it's important for me, this is just for me, to stick to the kind of things I want to write and say and do, and maybe not try and water that down for whatever reason.
Yeah, but on the other hand, you also don't want to sort of put yourself in your own box. What if you suddenly wanted to, like, I don't know, like, but what if you want to suddenly write a romance novel? Who knows? Like, what if you want to start writing kids' books? You know, you should. I'd be afraid of being boxed in. Yeah, exactly.
What about you as a writer?
No, I write more non-fiction, I guess. So I'd be afraid of literally getting it wrong, like factually.
Talking about being boxed in, what about like the Spoons book? Were you worried of becoming the Spoons guy?
I was more worried about the perception of that once the Brexit stuff started, actually, because it got signed before the Wetherspoons got involved in the Brexit debate, and at that point I was very much like, this is great, like Wetherspoons, culturally fascinating company within the UK, blah blah blah. But then it became a little bit of a toxic brand up to a point, and after the Brexit stuff. So I did have to field a lot of questions about Brexit, which I didn't really want to field. And I became a bit of a go-to to explain Tim Martin. Like, journalists would phone me up and be like, why does he? And I'm like, I've never met the guy. Like, why are you asking me?
Yeah, that's strange. A strange position to end up in.
Yeah, and I think I've moved away from it now anyway. But for a good couple of years, I was certainly the Spoons guy. And you know, there's other stuff in the pipeline now, which, you know, hopefully going
think
to counteract that. But
yeah, I think that must be a fear of a lot of writers, and it does, and creative people in general. It's almost like you want to be successful, but you don't want to have that one project that's way more successful than everything else, right? Because that can often become a problem for people, can't it?
On the other hand, publishers would probably like writers to write exactly the same book over and over again because it's easier to sell.
Yeah. And it can work. We mentioned Ballard, he did that, didn't
he? Yeah, he did, yeah.
Same book for 40 years. It was a good book, so it's all right.
Collect it all in one volume. All right, should we leave it there? I think that's a good note to go on.
I think so, yeah. I think we've covered a lot of our fears. Plumbed our psyches, haven't we? Put ourselves bare out there for people.
I feel like I should pay you some money for this hour. Okay.
Okay, so we'll be back next week.
I think we will, yeah. All right. Adios.
All right, bye-bye.